Hello, all my gorgeous brothers and sisters in Jesus, and all the wonderful little children of the world, and everything. I made another story up about there being a parallel. There's a parallel between them at Loch Ness and the present day and the 10 plagues of Egypt. So here it is. I'm going to read it to you right now. Daniela and her brother James lived along the beautiful Loch Ness in Scotland. It was a cold spring day, and Daniela took her brother James down to the Loch Cave to explore with torches. James saw a painting on the cave and exclaimed, "Look, Daniela, at this! People of ancient times must have drawn here. Maybe Nessie is real." Daniela looked at the painting and explained, "James, I think that might be the Leviathan creature." James asked, "What is a Leviathan?" Daniela explained, "It is a huge sea serpent-like creature. It was a very dangerous creature." James replied, "Maybe Nessie is his descendant." Daniela explained, "He could be, but I very much doubt that." On their way home, they saw a boy dressed in rags and looking very hungry. Daniela felt pity for him and asked him, "What is your name?" The boy replied, "George." Daniela continued, "Where are your parents? And where is your home?" George replied, "I have no parents or grandparents, and I am an only child. I have no home, family, food, or money." James replied, "My name is James, and she is my sister Daniela, my older sister. Maybe our parents can adopt you." But Daniela replied, "Don't be silly, James. Our parents cannot possibly adopt another child. However, we will hide you in our barn, as it is never used and nobody goes in it, and we will bring you food and drink to you every day. That we will sneak out of our parents' fridge and cupboards. Don't worry, we won't let you starve." George replied and said, "Thanks, you are too kind." On their way to take George to the barn, they stopped at the grocery store to buy groceries for their family with the pennies that their parents gave them for shopping. George sat outside and waited. They did not want to scare George with the owner of the grocery store, called Mr. Abler, who always gave them the creeps. They walked into the store that had a really creaky door, and they brought some eggs, fish, fruit, veg, and bread. Suddenly they heard screams coming from the ceiling, and what made it worse, red light liquid came leaking down from the ceiling. Mr. Abler came down with a big smile on his face and hands covered in red. James and Daniela's heart beat so fast that they quickly paid for their groceries and ran out again as fast as their legs could carry them. They looked back and saw Mr. Abler sweeping the shop floor with his broomstick and grabbed George and ran off. James cried, "Did you see that?" Daniela nodded yes. "And I think you need to be careful about him, because obviously he is a wizard, a witch that eats children in his secret cauldron and uses his broomstick to sweep the shop floor, but in secret he performs spells with it." James asked, "How can you be too sure about that?" Daniela replied, "Remember, I am 13 years old, but you were only 11, so I have more life experience than you." James replied, "Yes, big sister, that is true." George said nothing, but just followed them back home. They showed him a haystack to sleep in and kept him warm, and they sneaked out some blankets from their parents' home and food from the house, and he was happy to be found some new friends. The next morning, as James and Daniela were on their way to school, Mr. Abler was outside the grocery store sweeping the path when all of a sudden loads of frogs started coming out of nearby rivers The frogs caused chaos and even brought the traffic to a standstill. So James and Daniela had to walk to school instead of catching the school bus. As they looked back, they saw Mr. Abler shaking his broom. They panicked and ran away. Mr. Abler shouted, "Children, what is wrong? I'm not going to hurt you." But Daniela demanded, "James, do not talk to him, for he has cast another spell, and now we have a frog infestation. Did you notice how he shook his evil broom?" James replied, "Yes, I did, but maybe we can help him be good." But Daniela replied, "No. Now listen to me. Don't you ever talk to him. In fact, have nothing to do with him, unless we have to buy groceries from his store." James, do you understand? James nodded his head in agreement. Once all the children had arrived at the school, frogs were all over the place. On the playground, on the grass, in the classrooms. One of the female teachers, Mrs. Appleby, was having a panic attack, so that were the children, and they sent them all home again that day. When the children got home, Daniela and James went to see George, and to give him food and drink, and they told him all about the frog infestation. But he said nothing about it, but just listened. As they told their story, eventually the frogs went back to where they had come from, and there was peace that night, but it did not last for long. The next morning came around. They did not see Mr. Abler that morning, and went off to school happily. Daniela smiled. Maybe Mr. Abler is not going to make any bad spells happen on today. James smiled, and for the whole morning the teachers were happy, and James and Daniela played with all their friends just fine until they arrived back in their classrooms, and it started with one little girl called Lucy, who started to scratch her itchy scalp. Miss Appleby asked her if she could take a look in her hair, and Lucy agreed. Suddenly the whole class started scratching their scalps, and the entire school along with their teachers. Miss Garnett, the head mistress, sent the whole school home and advised them all to wash their hair with a potion that she gave to each individual in the school. She announced that a lice infestation had taken place. On their way home, Daniela said to James, "I don't understand how this lice infestation happened today, because Mr. Abler did not shake his broomstick that he cast spells with to make it happen." James thought about it and explained, "Maybe he also has a magic book that he has a list of spells in it, and then when he reads it in a certain way and chants, that activates his evil spells." Magic. Daniela replied, "You could have a point there. So the only way to combat evil spells from his book is to find a book that has good things in it." Then Daniela asked, "But what book would that do that?" James replied, "I am not sure, but maybe George knows." As usual, James and Daniela got back to their home and brought food and drink for George to eat, and they asked him, "George, do you know of any book that might have good things written in it?" George smiled and took out a dirty, dusty-looking book from out of his pocket and gave it to James and Daniela, and smiled. "Yes, in fact, I do. This is the Holy Bible. I have two of these, one that my parents gave me before they went to heaven, and another from a pastor who gave me the replica. So you can have that one that the pastor gave me." James and Daniela smiled and said, "Thank you." They ran off back in their house smiling, and they started to open the book and read it. They came across the story of Moses and the plagues of Egypt. Daniela said, "James, I have just discovered something. The plagues that they had in the Egyptian times is parallel to what has been happening so far. As all witches have hard hearts, he is by his magic making these things happen. Pharaoh, although he did not make the plagues happen by using his magic, still caused it to happen in a roundabout way, by being so hard-hearted into not letting the Israelites go free out of slavery. Moses, however, is the hero in trying to get them free." So maybe we need to find a hero also to stop Mr. Abler in his tracks. James asked, but who, Daniela? Daniela replied, how about our dad, or even us? Maybe we can follow him, or creep into his home when he is not looking, and find his book of spells, and that broomstick, burn his broomstick and his evil book. James replied, I don't know, sister. I think that is too dangerous, for he may try to turn us into frogs. If he sees us, Daniela replied, you have a point, so let's think of a plan. That night they went to sleep, and morning had arrived again. The school day came and went, and on their way home they spotted Mr. Abler, this time running towards his boat, with a book in his hand. Daniela and James hid behind some rocks, and Daniela whispered, let's go down to the caves where he is again, and follow him, and try to grab his book of spells. So they ran down to the hill and went to hid in the caves. Daniela whispered, as soon as he gets out of that boat, we will grab the book from his hands and hide, so he will not even notice it's gone. James smiled. What a great plan! They waited for hours, and Mr. Abler still out in the lock on his boat. They watched him as he studied his book intently. Eventually he came out, and they were just about to grab the book, when suddenly an infestation of flies came out on the rocks. Mr. Abler walked off, not even noticing the children, while the children's vision got blinded by the flies. Daniela sneered, we have got to put an end to his evil. James was taking no notice as he looked at the painting of the Leviathan and cheered, Daniela, isn't this Leviathan so cool? I hope we get to meet him one day. But Daniela snapped, there is more things to think about than your stupid Leviathan creature. James' feelings was hurt, but they had no time to argue, as the cave kept filling up with more and more flies, and they ran out of the cave. Eventually they escaped from the storm of flies, and James cried, although I love to see the painting of the Leviathan creature, there is no way that I am even going to set one foot back in that cave ever again. But Daniela reassured, it is okay, little brother, that will not happen again. What just has happened, neither will anything bad happen in there again. As long as Mr. Ava is not around, we are safe. They went back home, and that night Daniela, James and George relaxed. The next day was Saturday, so they did not have to go to school. In the afternoon, Daniela and James visited a farm, and they spent all day at the farm, and had fun feeding the animals and playing on the playgrounds there. They even had a nice ride on a horse and helped milk some cows. Adorable lambs leaped with joy, and the children enjoyed cuddling and feeding them. They also enjoyed a lovely picnic together on picnic tables. Daniela and James bounced on the trampolines, and even their parents had joined in with them. Back at home, Paul George was feeling hungry, and Daniela's thoughts went out to him as she announced, Mum, Dad, we have got to go home. Daniela's mum replied, but we have not had the tractor-trailer ride yet, and maybe James wants to stay to do that. But James also remembered George back home and said, no, it is okay, Mum and Dad, Daniela is right. We need to go home and finish off our homework, as we have a stack of it to do. Their dad asked them, are you two feeling okay? He continued, you both usually do all that you can to get out of doing homework. But the family agreed that they had a lovely day, and now they had to go home again. Once they got home, James and Daniela took a long look in the fridge and the cupboards, but had forgotten how much they had eaten and gave to George. And now there was hardly any food left. So their parents got them to go shopping at Mr. Abler's grocery store. At first, all seemed okay after they brought enough food for everyone to eat. But as they walked past Mr. Abler's cottage and small holding farm, There, as they walked past, they saw dead animals, all laid side by side. James and Daniela walked over to the dead horse, cow, donkey, and oxen. Their carcasses looked as if they had been infected with some kind of disease. Daniela and James looked at each other, and James asked, "Sister, do you think that Mr. Abler cast a spell to make these animals die?" Daniela nodded her head in agreement and said, "Yes, James, I'm afraid so." They both walked home feeling really upset about the animals. That night they told George about their day and what they read about the 10 plagues of Egypt. Daniela looked at George and James and said, "Tomorrow Mr. Abler is going to curse people with boils unless we put a stop to him." Sure enough, the next day came, and James and Daniela planned on visiting their friends at their homes. Their parents drove them out to visit their friends. As they passed in their parents' car, they noticed Mr. Abler, who smiled and waved at them. The children just gave him a dirty look, and Daniela whispered to James, "It is a good thing that you ignored him, because that smile he gave us is a grin to let us know that he is planning another one of his evil magic spells." Their dad asked, "What are you children whispering about?" Daniela replied, "Oh, nothing much, Dad. We were just talking about being excited about meeting our friends." Their dad smiled. "Oh, all right, kids. We are nearly there now." Once they arrived at their friend's house, who was another brother and sister, they got out of their car and went to greet them at the door, but their mum explained that they can't come in and play with the children because their children had come out in spots and did not want James and Daniela to catch them too. James and Daniela were disappointed, but their dad took them home and tried to call around other friends for them to play with. But all of their friends had caught these spots, so they just played on their own together. And that day around the caves, and that day also their dad took them out for a boat ride that evening. That night, James and Daniela grew even more cross with Mr. Abler, and not only were they planning to stop him, but now at this point revenge also for causing their friends to have what they thought were boils. George tried to calm them down as they came to visit him with food, but they were so cross that nothing could calm their anger. Sure enough, the next day came. That Monday morning, James and Daniela walked past Mr. Abler with an angry look on their face. He smiled and asked, "Why do you children look so angry?" Daniela snapped, "Don't act innocent. You know exactly what we were talking about." Mr. Abler explained, "Sorry, sweetheart, but I have no clue. Maybe come inside for a piece of cake and a glass of Coke, each of you, and we can talk things over." Daniela snapped, "No way, go away, just leave us alone." Mr. Abler sighed, "Oh, okay then." He then shrugged his shoulders and got on and swept the shop floor, and all of a sudden a bright light flashed across the sky coming from Mr. Abler's direction, and hail fell hard from the sky. A massive explosion took off, and fire was seen all around along with the hail. The children ran for cover, and fire engines came out. It took hours for the firefighters to put out the fire, but eventually they put the fires out. The children were traumatized and told to stay at home that day. Daniela tried to explain to her dad, "Daddy, Mr. Abler is a witch. He caused all these bad things to happen by using his magic evil spells." But her dad snapped, "That is enough. You are not to talk bad about Mr. Abler ever again." Daniela continued, "But Dad, he is the one who is causing parallels of the Egyptian plagues to happen here in Loch Ness in these days. We need a modern hero like Moses in order to stop him. And that hero, I think, is you, Daddy." But her dad was not listening and ordered, "That is it. Go to your room, both of you. I don't want to hear another word about Mr. Abler. Enough is enough." Daniela and James cried in unison, "But Daddy, you don't understand." They both stomped up to their rooms and slammed their doors hard, where they stayed all night until the next morning. After school that Tuesday afternoon, Daniela and Jane's parents told them to go and apologise to Mr. Abler for accusing them of being a witch. They both did not want to, but only went because they had to. Daniela and James felt terrified as they walked in the grocery shop. As usual, Mr. Abler was sweeping the floor, and he looked up and smiled at the children as he banged his broom on the floor. James and Daniela looked to the ground and saw at least 12 locusts crawling all over the shop floor. They both turned around and ran out of the shop again in panic. They ran back, and their dad, who was at their home door, and asked, "Did you apologise to Mr. Abler?" They answered, "No, sorry, Dad. We were so afraid because we went to his grocery shop and walked in, and he had locusts all over his shop floor, crawling all over the place." Their dad shook his head in disgust and reprimanded, "If you saw locusts and were afraid to go in, I will let you off for today, but tomorrow you have to go back and tell him that you are sorry. No excuses this time." They answered in unison, "Yes, Daddy." They went to take food to George in the barn and asked him, "George, why are you so quiet about Mr. Abler causing all the havoc that has been going on over the last few days?" George just smiled. "I don't like to get involved with disagreements or bad feelings against anyone. I am sent from heaven to help anyone in need." James asked, "What do you mean by help someone in need?" George just smiled and said, "You will find out when the time is right." Daniela sighed. "Surely now is the time. I am dreading tomorrow, when Mr. Abler causes darkness to come." Sure enough, the next day came and went, and the darkness did indeed come and cause the schools to be closed. That day passed into the evening. By this time, Daniela was beside herself with worry. She wept to her family. "I hate to request this, but we must find a lamb to kill tomorrow." And she said, "I hate to request this, but we must find a lamb to kill tomorrow and put its blood around our home, or I will die." Her parents asked, "What on earth are you talking about?" She explained, "Mr. Abler is going to cast a spell tomorrow for the equivalent of the last plagues of Egypt to happen right here and right now, which is the firstborn of every family is going to die." But her parents did not believe her, and the parents had a huge argument with James and Daniela. The next morning, Daniela woke up surprised to still be alive, but she went off to school with James, and as usual, on their way home from school, they came across Mrs. Lamb. She smiled at them and gave them a big bag of sweets each, and they thanked and hugged her. They looked over to Mr. Abler, who was reading his book, when all of a sudden Miss Lamb collapsed. A passer-by phoned up the ambulance immediately, and it arrived immediately. The ambulance people declared her dead. Mrs. Lamb's youngest brothers and sisters showed up. Daniela overheard Mrs. Lamb's sibling saying that she was the firstborn child out of them all, but now the firstborn, but because she's the firstborn, but now the first person but now the first person she will see is her husband, who passed away a year earlier. Daniela panicked. James ran after her, asking, "Why are you so afraid?" Daniela replied, "Don't you get it? Miss Lamb is a firstborn child, and so am I. Mr. Abler must have caused the cloud of death to pass over her, and now he is going to make it come my way, because I am a firstborn child, and Mum and Dad did not put lamb's blood around our home door." Mr. Abler was running after them, shouting, "Children, please wait, I just want to talk to you." But they replied in unison, "We don't even want to look at you." They ran off to the cave in a panic to hide. Again they came across the painting of the Leviathan. By this time they saw more paintings of them, and they followed them. A bright light was shining in the distance, and they walked towards the bright light. Suddenly the children found themselves in a desert, but next to the sea. They saw Egyptians and the Pharaoh in chariots, pulled by horses, running after Moses and the Israelites in the distance. The Israelite people were complaining, "Why have you brought us out of Egypt? We told you to leave us alone, because it would have been better for us to stay slaves to the Egyptians rather than all die in the desert." Moses replied, "Don't be afraid. Keep trusting in God, and He will help us, and He will fight for us and protect us." James looked at Daniela and asked, "How did we get here, and what will Moses do next?" Daniela replied, "Shh, just be quiet and wait and see." James replied, "Oh, sorry." God then spoke up and commanded, "Tell the Israelites just to keep walking forward and raise your rod over the sea and part the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." James and Daniela looked at each other as they saw the angel of God behind them, and then watched the pillar of cloud move from the front to the back to separate the Egyptians and the Israelites. Daniela and James stayed on the side of Moses and the Israelites. The cloud kept the two sides separated all night long. James went up to Moses and smiled. "Can we join you?" Moses smiled. "Yes, of course you both can." Daniela told Moses, "My name is Daniela, and my brother's name is James. We read about you in the Bible and think you are so cool." Moses smiled and said, "I am not sure what cool means, or where you read about me, but you seem like nice children. So you are both welcome to come on the journey with us." Moses then stood over the sea on a huge rock and stretched out his hand over the sea, and all night God kept the sea back with a powerful wind that kept dry land. The Israelites walked through on dry ground with sea walls both to their left and to their right. All the Egyptians giggled and rushed through. They saw the massive Leviathan swimming on their right. James cheered, "Look, here is the almighty Leviathan." Moses smiled. "Yes, he has been swimming in these oceans for years." Moses looked back and continued, "However, we have no time to stop and stare, as the Egyptians are coming after us." So the Israelites started to run fast. But when the Israelites safely reached the other side, the pillar of fire and cloud threw the Egyptians off into a confusion, and the wheels on their chariots fell off. Moses then stretched his hand over the sea, and it went back into place, and the Egyptians got swept into the sea. They were all drowned, and not one of them survived. All of the Israelites praised and sang to God. James and Daniela saw the Israelite children painting pictures of the Leviathan creature in the caves. They realized that the painting of what they saw at the Loch Ness caves was from them. Daniela walked up to Moses and asked, "If you saved the Israelites from Pharaoh, will you be our hero too and save us from Mr. Abler?" But Moses smiled. "You must go back to your own home and your own time now. I belong here. Just give Mr. Abler a chance. He may not be as bad as what you think he is." They obeyed Moses as he was their hero and walked back through the caves, back to their own time and place. As they looked at the drawings of the Leviathan back at Loch Ness, a wise man was exploring the caves at the same time, and he told them that the Israelites had painted those paintings after coming through the Red Sea, and how Leviathan used to be aggressive, but now he and his descendants are now all tame and friendly. Their paintings appear in many different caves around the world, and the Leviathan descendants are in deep lochs or lakes all around the world, but all are friendly and never show themselves to humans. The children ran off home excited, and by now knowing that God would protect them. However, as they crossed the road, the children did not look where they were going, and Daniela got run over by a car and who just drove off. She was unconscious, and George was on the scene. He walked over to her and raised her out of her coma. He smiled. "What you did not know is that all along as you were showing me kindness, that I was your guardian angel, waiting for this moment to come. Now I am going back to heaven. Your leg is hurt, but another helper is coming your way." George disappeared back into heaven, smiling. My my healing gift to you is a free gift, just as your kindness to me was a free gift. Shortly after, a car showed up. A man pulled up and got out of his car. The children didn't recognize him until they got into the light of the hospital. Daniela gasped in shock, Mr. Abler, but I thought you were trying to kill me. Mr. Abler laughed. What? Daniela continued. Why are you helping me when you are a wizard and eating children? Mr. Abler, confused, asked, Eat children? And be a wizard? And then he continued, I don't eat children. Daniela continued, but I saw you after a child screamed. But I saw you after a child screamed and you came down with red hands and blood was leaking from your roof. Mr. Abler laughed. No, child, that's not what happened at all. The red you saw was iron caused by toxins in the water. My daughter screamed because the water turned red as she took a shower. So I tried to fix it, but my hands went red trying to fix it. Daniela replied. What about the frog infestation then? Mr. Abler replied. That was again caused by the toxic in the water. It causes tadpoles to grow faster and for frogs to crawl out of the water. Daniela asked, What about the lice in the head then? Mr. Abler replied, Unfortunately, children get lice, and that spreads fast, and it's just an unfortunate thing that happens. Daniela continued. What about the flies then? And we saw you with a book about to cast spells. Mr. Abel laughed. That is not a book of spells, but my book on how to catch fish. I just went fishing, and I would never want to cast a spell on anyone. As for the flies, it was due to the frogs dying and being around their carcasses. Daniela continued, Okay, but we saw dead animals on your small holding. Why did you kill them? Mr. Abler replied, Well, I did everything I could to try and heal them, but they were suffering, so I had to get a vet to put them out of their suffering and put them down. Daniela continued, And the boils? But Mr. Abler said, Sorry, kid, still no spell, but chicken pox, which is common in childhood. Daniela asked, What about the load of locusts on the shop floor? And the hell and the fire and the darkness then. Mr. Abler explained that his neighbour's pet locust escaped and he was just trying to help catch them. That the darkness was caused by a very rare solar eclipse that only happens over a few hundred years, and the hell was a lightning bolt that hit, and the hell coming out of heaven, and the magic light was a lightning bolt that hit the garage petrol tanks and it ignited into an explosion. Daniela then asked, Last but not least then, why did Mrs. Lamb die so young? She was only in her 30s and she had many years ahead of her. But Mr. Abel replied, Mrs. Lamb, she looks young for her age because she's on a vegan diet. Only eating raw foods, but in fact, she was in her 80s, and she was also suffering from a heart disease, which nobody ever knew about because she never ever told anyone, which eventually killed her. And unfortunately, it was that time when she died. Daniela and James then felt so bad with themselves for judging Mr. Abler so wrong, but eventually they became friends, and he forgave them, and they never forgot the wonderful adventure that they had in meeting Moses and crossing through the Red Sea with him. And that's the end of the story. And my thoughts are we are never to judge anyone or jump into conclusions before knowing all the facts. Matthew 7 is do not judge, or you too will be judged. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that story and was blessed by it. God bless you all for now. Bye.